Chapter 20, Act 20, Eblanessa Tales. Act 20, Eblanessa Tales. The Pulse of Babel. Eblan, the morning of the moon's return. Edward Geraldine, king of Eblan and last of his name, sheathed his twin blades, Murasame and Masamune, in the holsters that had been hastily strapped to his back. He stared wordlessly at his defeated opponents, better known throughout their kingdom as the Eblan Four, who were now laying helplessly at his feet. The battle had been over in moments. He had been taken by surprise, but even four energetic ninjas who didn't seemingly hate mornings nearly as much as he were no match for his unfailing agility and his unquenchable need to simply eliminate any obstacle that got in the way of his having a good time. Some called that second item a character flaw. He considered it a desirable skill. It was good to know what you wanted out of life, right? He had originally awoken early to get some reading in, or at least, that's what he liked to call it, when a new issue of Ninja Sutra showed up under his door, concealed in a plain paper wrapper. Almost as if he had known Edge was up to something fun, the seneschal had started in on him earlier than scheduled. Usually he waited for Edge to saunter into the throne room and settle in before picking the day's fight, but not today. Edge heard the pounding footsteps and the banging on his door that acted as the prelude to yet another lecture. He had at least wised up during the last 17 years and had gotten a lock put on his door when their castle was rebuilt, so the seneschal could only scream at him through the door of his bedroom while he struggled to pull on his pants and plan his escape. The seneschal was going on about royal duty, responsibility, being leaderful, blah, blah, blah. Edge couldn't be positive, but he wondered if this had had anything to do with him clearing out the liquor stores last night to throw an impromptu engagement party for one of the more fetching ladies of the castle, whose boyfriend in Agard had finally proposed. Edge was always looking for a reason to celebrate, and an impending marriage was as good a reason as any. He wasn't sure how long they would actually be engaged, considering the young lady had tried to lay what would have been a delicious kiss on Edge late into the party, but he had been perfectly honorable and sent her on her way back to her room, alone, so at least the seneschal couldn't yell at him about being a homewrecker, too. When he was sufficiently dressed in somewhat clean, dark blue, cotton garb that he had fetched from the floor, his pants hurriedly tucked into his brown sheepskin boots and gold obi tied crookedly around his waist, he shoved the magazine inside his obi and snuck out of his room by climbing out the window. As he draped his legs over the windowsill, he couldn't help but glance up toward the Tower of Babel to the west. He felt his pulse accelerate when he observed what he swore was a faint silver glow enveloping the tower, tracing its outline against the still dark dawn sky. Maybe I'm finally losing it. Someone would have come to my door a lot earlier if the tower were actually lit up. Edge dropped from the window, running across the roof until he could scale down the tower and drop into the courtyard in a nonchalant fashion. In a castle full of ninjas, having your king suddenly materialize out of thin air was no big deal. He figured he could blend right in with the other early risers and slip out the front door, unnoticed. It had been when he crossed the castle gates in attempt to flee to the beach that he had been ambushed by the four ninjas that had no idea what type of errand they were getting in the way of, and thus were doomed before the first blade had even been drawn. The first of his fallen opponents, Zangetsu, an elderly man with wispy white hair tied back into a low ponytail and a tanned complexion that resembled that of a well-loved leather glove, climbed to his feet shakily, brushing the dust off of his black bodysuit and giving a strange chortle as he tossed his monarch yellow cloak back over his shoulders. Just as I would have expected, master. Behind him, Edge's second opponent rose as well. Gekao, a middle-aged gentle giant, stooped down to retrieve his battle axe, hoisting it over his shoulder while using the red hood of his cloak as an impromptu sweat rag. Even with the four of us together, we were like mere children against your assault. We are still lacking in every way. Izayoi, a striking young woman with thick, dark hair swept into a high ponytail that sat at the crown of her head, lamented as she kicked at a stray rock with a navy blue leather boot. Tsukinawa, both the final challenger and the smallest, piped up from behind Izayoi, his older cousin. He was technically her first cousin once removed, being that his mother was Izayoi's actual cousin, but the Eblanessa liked to keep things simple, so any familial relation more complex than that simply became cousin. Truly, you have earned your name as master of our clan. Edge sighed, crossing his arms over his chest and turning away. Quit buttering me up like that. I've gotten far more out of shape than I care to admit. In the peak of his training, Edge was sure they wouldn't have even gotten the drop on him in the first place. He would have sniffed them out and taken them down before they could have even blinked. But he had let his training regimen go, particularly in the past few years, for a large variety of reasons. Tsukinawa laughed, his oversized green shawl that drowned his petite frame billowing in the early morning wind. You're so modest, master. I have heard many tales about the great feats you have accomplished in the past. Could it be that you are still holding back to protect us from injury? Modest. Edge nearly fell over in shock. He had been called a lot of things in his life, mostly deplorable, four-letter words, and modest was never one of them. Izayoi gave her cousin's violet ponytail a hard tug, and he squealed as his head yanked back involuntarily.
Hold your tongue, Tsukinawa. Master Edge wouldn't hold himself back for anyone, friend or foe.
Edge turned to look at her, smiling slightly, not that any of them could see behind his dark blue cowl.
Don't worry about it. I'd rather you give it to me straight and say what's on your mind. If you thought I was holding back, it means I'm going to have to up my game the next time you try to pull a sneak attack on me. I'll admit it was an ambitious attempt.
Zangetsu bowed his head.
You are tolerant as always, Master. Sacrificing your own time to offer each of us your training. I, Zangetsu, could hope for no higher honor in my lifetime. It's only because you all practically twisted my arm to do this,
Edge protested. Am I ever going to get to look at this STEM magazine? He could practically feel it burning a hole through his waistband.
We cannot afford to have Evelyn's traditional ninja arts fade away into history, Master.
Gekao frowned.
We understand that as king, you have more important things to focus on, we just want to do our part to keep our kingdom's legacy alive. Don't you think we'd be better off without these lethal weapons we call arts?
Edge arched an eyebrow.
In a world where we can now be free to be anything, do we really want to be best known as assassins?
Increasingly, but not yet overwhelmingly, more of the kingdom's citizens were no longer actively practicing ninjutsu or pursuing a way of life that would have kept them solely in Eblan from birth until death, something Edge unabashedly celebrated, even though the shift in culture had drawn some criticism from the realm. Slowly and guardedly since he had inherited his title, Edge had introduced the concept of a more global Eblan to his people, inspired by the bonds he had forged with the fearless Baronians he had traveled to the moon with, Rydia of Mist, and the others around the world he had come to know thanks to Cecil. At first there had been aggressive pushback. Eblan had been isolated from the rest of the world for as long as anyone still alive after Rubiconte's assault could remember, and they would tell you that they had been doing just fine. But having a youthful, and some would say a rather charismatically impulsive, king on the throne had done a lot to sway the hearts of the younger citizens who had been instrumental in reviving Eblan and who had experienced firsthand the benefit of having allies around the globe to help restore the kingdom's fortunes. And the rest of the world had become more curious about Eblan as well, so despite some of those younger citizens growing up and starting a life elsewhere, now finally feeling free enough to do so, many immigrants were anxious to take their place, lured by the concept of starting over after the war in a forgotten land, and Edge felt Eblan had become only stronger for it. Izayoi approached Edge, her arms folded underneath what he had always appreciated from afar as a blessedly endowed chest.
But your arts can be used for far more than the taking of someone's life, Master. As long as we have yet to meet our full potential, we must continue to strive for the limits of human ability. Only by evolving can future generations hope to thrive long after we are gone, just as you have become as strong, if not stronger than your late parents, someday your children will surpass you as well.
Edge narrowed his granite-flecked blue eyes, hoping it would deflect from the blush he started to feel crawling up his cheek. Children? Ha! That ship had sailed long, long ago.
Maybe if the times called for that, but we're living in an era of peace. So why work so hard at this? Wouldn't you rather have some fun with your lives?
Izayoi pouted, and Edge raised his hand, lightly running his thumb over her dirt-streaked cheek as he locked onto her ice-blue stare.
Especially a woman your age, I might add.
She turned bright red, and Tsukinawa snickered behind her.
Ah, our wise master understands even a woman's heart. You little brat.
Izayoi shrieked, spinning away from Edge's grasp and diving on top of her tiny cousin. Tsukinawa screamed, his eyes rolling in the back of his head as Izayoi pinned him to the ground with her thighs and started tickling him mercilessly. Gekao and Zangetsu both clasped their hands to their mouths, trying not to burst into laughter, and even Edge couldn't help but snicker underneath his cowl. This is what things are supposed to be like. Each of you have dedicated your entire lives to Eblan with so little in return. I still feel so selfish, as much as I've tried to make things better for you, for everyone, since our home was destroyed 17 years ago. Why can't you let the past go and just try to enjoy life for what it is? Izayoi, a beautiful young woman like yourself should have the pick of the kingdom's finest men, falling all over themselves just for you to gift them with a passing glance. Tsukinawa, you're just a boy, only 15 years old, and the first child born after disaster struck Eblan. You've known nothing but peace, yet you've become an even stronger warrior than I was at your age, and have the ever-darkening shadows in your eyes to prove it. Zangetsu, you should be enjoying your twilight years, sitting on the patio with Seneschal and complaining about what a pain in the ass all these young people are, not breaking your back to continue the ninjutsu training your son never got to finish. And Gekao, the Eblin Force tireless leader? You always smile through your pain, and even when I inadvertently belittle your dream to keep the ninja arts alive. When was the last time you did anything for yourself? Edge pressed his lips together, closing his eyes. Of course, I should probably take my own advice. But I've always been a hypocrite, haven't I? There are just some things and people I can't seem to make myself ever forget, that keep me chained to the past. Tsukinawa gasped for breath, trying to choke out a cry for mercy when his gaze suddenly froze on the skies above, the blood draining from his face. Izayoi blinked, pausing with her hands buried in his armpits.
What is it, Tsukinawa?
Zangetsu asked gently. But the boy could not bring himself to reply, his voice cracked with the effort before he gave up. Edge followed Tsukinawa's gaze upward. For a moment, he thought he was seeing double, which was entirely possible with the amount he had drunk last night. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and took another look.
What they?
The moon, which had reached its fullest phase just last night and was still visible in the dawn, had been joined by a second moon, a perfect orb as white as an exhumed skull, unyielding in its brilliance as it cast a burgeoning shadow over its twin. The seneschal removed his stocking cap, fanning himself with it as he shook his head.
That dreadful moon has returned. Oh, what is the meaning of this? Oh, calm down, old man,
Edge drawled, burying his head in his hands as if to physically block out any more whining. How could he possibly think with all of this racket? With the way Seneschal was fretting about, it sounded as if 1,000 puttering old men were marching through the throne room in their morning slippers. He dug his fingers into his silver hair to keep it from flopping into his eyes, groaning audibly. Perhaps it had been his mistake to say anything, but as soon as he and his disciples, as they liked to call themselves, had recovered from the shock of their discovery, he had dismissed them and found his feet whisking him away to the throne room, where he knew the seneschal would have been waiting after figuring out that Edge had escaped from his bedroom in the middle of his tirade. Before he could stop himself, the sordid discovery was pouring out of his mouth, and then had commenced the panic. Seneschal, as Edge had always, sometimes with affection, but mostly with disdain, called him because he had never comprehended as a child that the man had an actual name, approached the throne, his hands on his hips.
How could one possibly stay calm at a time like this?
Edge glared up at him through his fingers, snorting.
If you don't, you'll give yourself a heart attack. Then who would pester me? Your young highness. See? You know I hate it when you call me that. I'm 43, for God's sake. I could hardly imagine calling you anything else, young highness. And now that Eblin finally got itself back on its feet, this moon again rears its ugly head. I fear this may not be the only specter from the past that we will see once again.
Seneschal moaned and began another round of hurried pacing.
Enough,
Edge muttered, dropping his hands and letting his locks fall over his face like a curtain.
Your young highness.
Edge stood from the throne, his hands on his hips and his mouth pressed in a thin line.
Seneschal, what would our soldiers and citizens think if they saw you like this?
Seneschal paused mid-step, his eyes shifting away guiltily from Edge's as he clutched his cap.
I apologize, my lord. I bow before your wisdom.
He shook his head.
You are truly the son of our late beloved ruler and queen. That sounds exactly like something they would have said.
Edge stared at him for a couple beats, his tongue pressed against his teeth. It was with muted terror that he realized when he tried to play what he had said back in his mind using his parents' voices, nothing happened. He was struggling more and more nowadays to remember what they had sounded like when they had been alive, along with other little things, like the way his mom's ruby lips would twist when she was trying not to laugh at something stupid he had done that she felt the need to lecture him for, or the way his dad's eyes exploded with fireworks when Edge would catch him stealing a glance at his bride-turned-queen, whom he had never spent an hour in his life not being in love with since the day they had met.
Right. Watch the castle for me.
Edge strode toward the throne room doors, and the seneschal frowned.
Your young highness. Where are you going?
Edge didn't turn around, but he did pause in the threshold.
Off on a bit of business. At a time like this. Millimeter hum. So watch the castle for me, all right? Please. Please don't do anything reckless, your young highness. Whatever you are planning, you don't have to do it by yourself, you know.
Edge looked down to the floor, which was comprised of dent-ridden, dusty bamboo slabs. 17 years had sure taken a toll on their luster. He couldn't remember his parents' voices, but he could still perfectly picture the gaping, incinerated pit that had formed in this very spot when Ruby Cant had scorched their castle and village, wiping out 3/4 of their population in mere minutes. He had been arguing with his mother in the throne room about something arbitrary when the ceiling above had collapsed in flames, crashing through the floor mere feet away from his mother's throne. He issued a final order before leaving.
Stop worrying so. It's not good for your heart, or my ears.
Marching back out the way he had come, Edge slid his cowl back over his mouth and nose as he stepped back out into the desert air, which had already heated up several degrees. He spotted a thick shadow looming to his left, and heard a voice call out from above.
Where might you be going?
Gekao leapt from the roof of the castle gateway, bushy black eyebrows raised over his permanently sleepy gaze.
Gekao.
Edge blinked. Zangetsu joined them, wincing slightly as he landed harder than perhaps his knees appreciated. Edge swore he heard the grinding of the elderly ninja's very bones.
If there is something that needs to be done.
Izayoi materialized at Edge's side, her eyes wide and questioning. Tsukinawa popped up on Izayoi's shoulder, his hands encircling her neck as he pushed his head past her waterfall of hair.
Then please, allow us to handle it.
Edge laughed nervously, scratching his head.
What do you mean? You intend to investigate the return of the second moon by yourself, do you not?
Zangetsu smiled knowingly, and Edge forced out another laugh, which sounded more like a choking donkey.
The moon is causing severe unrest within Eblan as we speak.
Gekao frowned.
Everyone I've spoken with is scared, your highness. Please make use of us if there is a need for reconnaissance,
Izayoi added.
What are you talking about?
Edge asked innocently, which came off as convincing as a cat surrounded by scattered bird feathers.
I'm not doing anything like that.
Tsukinawa jumped down from Izayoi's shoulders and wagged his finger.
Master, I know this will displease you to hear, but Seneschal is right. You always try to bear all the burden by yourself.
Edge reddened. So, Tsukinawa had already been doing a little reconnaissance of his own in the throne room, and he hadn't even sensed the boy's presence. He really was slipping. Izayoi clasped her hands together.
Please, Master. Let the four of us share that burden. This is what we have been training for, after all.
Edge turned away from the four of them, snorting under his breath.
I have yet to decide whether any of you are ready for such a mission. Then let this mission be a test of our readiness.
Tsukinawa cried, gently tugging on Edge's sleeve.
You would know for sure then, right?
Zangetsu rested his hands on Tsukinawa's shoulders.
Besides, we can ill afford to have our leader away from his kingdom right now. Your people need you, your highness.
Edge pressed his lips together, still refusing to look at any of their pleading faces. None of us know or understand what this moon is all about. If I put them in any danger, how could I ever forgive myself? I promised when I took the throne that Eblan would never again suffer another catastrophe like 17 years ago. The day Ruby Cant smoked us out of our home like rats and destroyed everything, I still had no idea the true hell that awaited us just steps away in that damned tower. If it wasn't for Cecil, Rosa, Rydia, and yes, even that bastard Kane, I wouldn't be here today. So how can I ask these four to possibly embark on a journey that may wind up going down that same dark path? A king is replaceable. They would surely understand that if they were in my shoes. I have always known that there are better suited men for this position than I that could lead Eblan to prosperity if I were to go absent. But their dreams, their hopes, their aspirations for the future? Those are what makes up Eblan's lifeblood, not ninjutsu, not an elite clan. Not a mere figurehead like me. Those are what we must always protect, no matter the price.
I already asked the seneschal and the rest to handle my affairs,
Edge finally said quietly.
It may be my overreaching on my part, but the return of the twin moon might indicate that it may not be long before that tower is set in motion again, my lord.
Zangetsu frowned, and Edge involuntarily shivered, closing his eyes.
That tower.
Mom? Dad? The horrors of the Tower of Babel stole you away from me. And none of us had known that the silent monolith we were guarding with our lives contained the gateway that made our planet vulnerable to intergalactic devastation. And just a year after I lost you, it tried to take Cecil, the twins, and Rydia too. I'll do whatever it takes to see that it is never activated again. Perhaps the further I can send these four away from it, the safer they will be. After a few minutes of silence, feeling 4 pairs of eyes bore into him like daggers, Edge turned around to meet their stares.
All right. You're on.
Tsukinawa jumped in the air, pumping his fists.
I knew you would understand, master.
Izayoi bent to one knee, lowering her head.
Your orders, then, sir. Let's get one thing clear first,
Edge warned, and Gekao stood next to Izayoi protectively, a rare sulk settled into his features.
What would that be? Don't throw your lives away in vain. They are too valuable to waste. Yes, master.
The 4 of them chanted in unison, bowing their heads. Edge tugged his cowl down beneath his chin, letting out a quiet sigh. His glance flicked from Gekao to Zangetsu, Izayoi, and finally Tsukinawa, who was still grinning even through his bow.
Gekao. You said you spoke with some others in the castle. What did you find out?
Gekao turned his weary crimson eyes upon Edge.
Most people are just very confused, your highness. I did hear an interesting comment from one of the guards who was just coming off his shift from last night. He said he saw a shooting star in the northeastern sky. Northeastern?
Edge blinked.
Toward Baron. Even further, allegedly.
Gekao crossed his arms.
He reckoned it could have been as far as Damcyan. That is interesting.
Edge tilted his head toward the sky, catching another glance at the moons.
We may want to see if Damcyan or Fabul are impacted. Gekao, as the one who has the most combat experience out of the 4 of you, I want you to travel between the 2 kingdoms and see what they are up to. Mount Hobbs is littered with the undead, and you would have the greatest advantage with your fire ninjutsu. It's been a while since we've checked up on our northern neighbors and their crystals anyway. Yes, sir.
Gekao nodded, bowing. Edge turned next to Zangetsu.
Zangetsu. I want you to travel to the underworld and observe the dwarven settlement located at King Jot's castle. You can check on the crystal of darkness that resides there and see if anything unusual has happened similarly to the shooting star on the surface world. A few months ago, the dwarves discovered a mineral vein in what had been an abandoned mine that they opened up again. We should be able to access that mine from the mountains just north of the castle, and you can make your way to Jot's territory from there. Consider it done.
Zangetsu bowed.
Izayoi. Yes.
She piped up.
I need you to infiltrate Troya and check on the status of the Crystal of Earth. I've also heard some rumors that one of their epochs has fallen ill. I would be interested in learning if they have found a suitable replacement yet. You would be the least suspicious if you were to go. Very well, Master Edge,
she nodded, although her voice carried a tinge of disappointment. Edge had noticed, but couldn't bring himself to say any more for the moment.
That leaves the Crystal of Water, right?
Tsukinawa smiled.
Does this mean I get to go back to my city?
Edge nodded.
Yes, but remember, you have to take on your identity as a mage while you are there. You've done well so far with establishing your fake persona, but you'll need to come up with an alibi for why you haven't been around for so long. Don't worry, I'll think of something clever.
Tsukinawa broke into a huge grin, whispering to himself breathlessly.
And I'll get to see her again. Who?
Izayoi smirked, and Tsukinawa jumped, turning pink.
No one. Wait here,
Edge instructed.
I'll be right back.
He swiftly walked back into the castle, making a right from the courtyard and approaching the provisions shop that was tucked into a corner, walled off by curtains of purple and violet Chinese wisteria that had invaded years ago during the restoration effort and now exploded into grapevine-like blooms every spring.
What will it be today, Your Highness?
The shopkeep asked, a young man whom Edge knew spent long nights patrolling the desolate Eblanessa desert as part of a small group of castle guards who hunted monsters, and then spent his days manning his merchant family's shop. He didn't really understand when the man actually slept, but then again, the days of his youth where he had been able to once do the same thing were long, long behind him, so he supposed he didn't need to understand anymore.
I need teleport stones.
Edge impatiently tapped his fingers on the polished oak counter.
Have we gotten any in?
The man turned, stretching up on his toes as he reached to one of the higher shelves behind him.
Only looks like I have 4. There's been a run on magical items lately. I'll take whatever you have.
Edge dug into his pockets, but only retrieved a few lint balls and a cork from a champagne bottle. The shopkeep raised his eyebrows.
Shall I put it on your tab, Your Highness? Yeah. That would be good.
Edge sighed, shoving his treasures back in his pocket.
I will be paying that soon, by the way. I heard we had good luck in the market and got quite a few items sold. I'm happy to help out when I can, Your Highness.
He smiled, sliding the dark gray, polished stones over the counter.
All things considered, with this moon people have been whispering about, I'm not worried about it.
Edge pocketed the stones, silently thanking the gods for his people's tendency to lean toward discretion in their dealings, and walking back outside to the castle gates. His disciples looked up at him anxiously, and he produced the stones.
Time is of the essence. I need each of you to reach your destinations as soon as possible and make it home safely. These stones are blessed with the white magic spell teleport, and will take you to anywhere you want as long as you can picture it clearly in your mind. You can only cast the spell a few times before the mana wears out, so use with caution. Thank you, Master,
Zangetsu said, taking the first stone.
Unfortunately, having never been to the underworld before, I will need to make my way there by foot, but rest assured I will use this to escape the moment I have secured the information you desire. Aren't these expensive?
Tsukinawa blinked as he took his, and as Aoi gave his ponytail another tug.
Honestly.
After the stones had been distributed and safely deposited in various pockets and pouches, Edge crossed his arms over his chest and gave the Eblin for one last appraisal. There was a spark of excitement in the air, although it was entirely surrounding his disciples. All he could feel was an increasing despair curling around in his gut like the icy fog that protected the village mist.
Remember what I said, do not be so anxious to prove yourselves that you put yourself in mortal danger. You're no good to me, or Eblin, dead.
In the far western expanses of the desert, Edge could feel the tower watching them. Zanjutsu's Tale Morning Moon.
Did you hear the rumor, Lolly? About the tower? Yep. A watchman outside said it was glowing, just for a second. Got the king all riled up, but no one has seen it light up again since. Now they're saying he was still perhaps a bit tipsy yet from the night before. Quiet. He's coming.
The dwarves' raucous conversation dulled as the throne room doors opened, and their king appeared in the threshold, ever resplendent in his massive Viking horn helmet that added 2 feet to his sturdy frame. They all snapped to attention, heads raised and arms to their sides as Jut peered over each of them with unblinking yellow eyes.
Another quiet, peaceful day, my men. I wouldn't wish it any other way.
One of the dwarves leaned to his right, his whisper muffled by massive beard of orange braids and curls.
I guess the king dismissed the rumor about the tower.
Shh. The dwarf next to him replied nervously, feeling a large bead of sweat trickle down his temple. The last thing he wanted was King Jot's, or anyone else's, attention. He reached up, casually scratching at his beard in an attempt to mask his discontent and relishing in the sweet relief of what had felt like a forbidden act. The wiry hair had the same sensation as an itchy, healing, wound that was spread all over his face. The dwarf who had whispered to him raised one tufted brow, but said no more and turned his attention back to the front. If King Jut had noticed anything amiss, he didn't give it away. He was too busy puffing his chest and traipsing down the line of dwarves, his purple robes swirling around him like churning waves of magma as his hands animatedly fluttered in the air.
We would never have earned this peace if it weren't for the hard work put in by all of you. Indeed, great were the causalities we suffered in that costly war of the crystals. But we strove on. Yes, we soldiered on through the heartache, and... Lollyho, here he goes again,
another dwarf muttered.
Once he gets started, the king doesn't know when to stop. I swear, this is the same speech he gave when the war ended 17 years ago, and he's just never bothered to memorize a new one since. Regardless, to all of you, I offer my congratulations on another day's work well done. Now it is time to rest for the day yet to come. Make sure not to overindulge this evening.
He gave a wave, turning to make his way back into the throne room.
Lolly-ho!
The dwarves all cheered, and leapt into the air simultaneously to do a spinning jump. This could only be best described to those who had yet to witness such a spectacle as the dwarven version of a high five. But the nervous dwarf on the far right of the queue leapt too late, his arms flailing as he landed back on the stone floor clumsily, an awful cracking noise ringing out in the grand hall. The 3 other dwarves that were in the queue with him turned in panic, their mouths agape as the doors slammed behind King Jot. The short jumper blushed fiercely, not that you could tell under the oversized helmet that was casting obsidian shadows over the parts of his face not already concealed by unruly red facial hair.
You all right?
One of the dwarves blinked.
That wasn't much of a jump.
The dwarf nodded, climbing back to his feet and giving it one more go. This time, the jump was executed perfectly, he even gave a little bow when he had landed.
Of course I am. Guess I was just enraptured by His Highness' speech. Talai-ho. What? Lolly-ho.
The 3 dwarves glanced at each other concernedly before turning back to him.
Lolly-ho, indeed. A dwarf is nothing if he can't jump high. You need to take better care of your legs, especially if you're going to be patrolling with us from now on. Maybe you should go to the infirmary and see a nurse. No, I'm fine.
The 4th dwarf laughed, trying to resist the temptation to reach up and violently rake his nails across his scratchy beard. I can't take much more of this. The other dwarves shrugged.
Well, our work is done. Off to the pub for some rest and relaxation. If you're up to it, you should join us, newbie. You'll find the pub upstairs on the right. It's down the corridor between the weaponsmith and armorer. Lolly-ho, I'll be there.
The dwarf nodded, and watched as the other 3 departed. Although the room was still crowded with other dwarves coming and going, he had figured out rather quickly that this chamber was the crossroads of the castle. He finally felt anonymous enough to give in to his urges. Scritch scritch scritch. Ahhh. He lowered his hands from his face, sighing happily under his breath. That's better. Now, to see to the crystal. Reaching up to adjust his slumping helmet, he teetered toward the throne room, where 2 dwarven guards nodded to him and opened the doors. Inside, King Jut was, much to the dwarf's relief and surprise, passed out in his throne. He was slumped backward, his mouth wide open as his snores ripped through the otherwise peaceful chamber. His daughter, Crown Princess Luca, was sitting cross-legged on the floor in a bubblegum pink shop suit, a bobby pin sticking out of her lips as she gingerly ran a boar bristle brush through what appeared to be a life-sized doll's cascading yellow curls. As soon as she had heard the newcomer's footsteps, she glanced up, pulling the pin out from between her lips and sliding it into a lock of the doll's hair.
Whatever you do, don't touch these dolls. Try it, and you'll pay.
She warned. The dwarf scuttled back a few inches even though he had had no intention of approaching her in the first place, nodding hastily. She reminds me a little bit of Master Edge. Only with his special books instead of dolls. Another guard that was standing to the rear of Jot's throne offered a smile in Luca's stead.
Come to pray to the crystal, have you? It's really nice to see a dwarf with respect nowadays.
Before he could reply in the affirmative, the guard hit a switch behind him, and a hidden door in the alabaster brick wall swung open, unleashing a spill of light from the mirrored chamber it had been concealing.
Well, go on then. I'll close the door after you so you can have some privacy.
Stepping inside, the dwarf heard the door grind back shut behind him as he narrowed his eyes in an attempt to adjust to the dazzling light that was igniting the chamber before him. Shining on the dais at the top of a short set of stairs was the amber-stained crystal of darkness, or at least one of 4 that resided in King Jot's domain. He watched amusedly as his reflection glittered back at him, not revealing the visage of a dwarf recently transferred from the mines to foot patrol at the castle, but rather an elderly human with shining onyx eyes and a much tamer and wider snippet of a goatee. I've never seen a crystal before. How fascinating that even its holy light can see through the deceit of our arts. Zangetsu lowered his shoulders, finally feeling for the first time since he donned his disguise that he could relax. By his estimate, he had been in Jot's kingdom for nearly 12 hours, although to him, it had felt like days. He had made his way through the Eblin Mountains and found the hidden path that he could take to the dwarves' mine with little trouble. Once he had spotted his first dwarf hacking away at a deposit of ore, he cast a ninjutsu spell called Illusions to mimic the miner's look. Although he hadn't gotten it quite perfect, his clothes were mostly too big and his facial hair was so bushy that he had to cut some of it back with his spear just to see properly. Still, he was mildly confident that it would have received a passing grade from his Aoi, who had been the one to teach the spell to him. He had nonchalantly bumped into the miner, making up what he had hoped was a not too outrageous sounding claim that he had reported to the mines for work that morning but had been reassigned to the castle and was not sure how to make his way there. Before he knew it, he had been dropped off at Jot's castle and had been taken in by the group he had spent the rest of the day with, hunting monsters during the low tide of the magma that boiled all around them. He had not needed to do much to gain acceptance, his awkward mannerisms and stilted speech simply gave the dwarves the impression that he had been transplanted from some backwater village. During his outing, he had not noticed anything unusual, or at least, nothing that he thought was unusual for residents of the underworld. The concept of not being able to see the sky and having magma act as a sun was completely foreign to Zangetsu, but his fellow dwarves had not seemed to think anything was amiss. There were no talks of shooting stars or other phenomena that plagued the surface world, and monsters were apparently still a common enough occurrence that their presence was not suspicious. And now he had confirmed that the crystal was safe and sound, but the rumor that had been spilled just a few minutes ago before King Jut had come out to greet them was troubling. I need to find the dwarf that saw the Tower of Babel glow. If he's known for his love of drink, he may just be in the pub with the others. Despite following what he thought were the correct directions to the pub, Zangetsu became helplessly disoriented and once again fell to the mercy of a stranger, although he supposed that just helped solidify his facade that he was a country bumpkin lost in the big city. After being escorted to the pub, he stepped inside and instantly regretted his idea to find the dwarf who started the tower rumors. The pub was packed to the gills with so many dancing, drunken dwarves that he had no idea where to start, with loud accordion music blasting from the bar top where a dwarf that had to be at least 400 pounds was jigging thunderously while playing his instrument. Half of the kingdom must be here getting toasted, Zangetsu frowned. No one is going to have any idea what I am talking about if I ask about the tower's glow. I'm just going to have to find it and see what is going on for myself. A dwarf that was swaying to the music, both of his hands clutching dangerously overfilled mugs that splashed ale on Zanjutsu's boots leaned in, grinning.
What? Looking for some fun?
Zanjutsu's eyes darted, panicked, around the room. Perhaps Master Edge should have taken the underworld instead of I. This is much more his scene.
Where are the watchmen stationed that can best see the Tower of Babel?
The dwarf hiccuped, taking a long, draining sip from his glass before replying.
Yeah, you're right, the watchmen should be here too. Why don't you go fetch them and lolly-ho it up a bit, hey? They should be on the roof, they're probably sobered up by now.
Sure. Zangetsu nodded, bowing his head quickly.
Thank you. I mean, lolly-ho. Lolly-ho.
The dwarf cheered, and a chorus of lolly-hos erupted behind Zangetsu as all of the patrons raised their glasses to their mouths and began to chug. Zangetsu backed out of the pub, a fake smile plastered onto his face as he asked for directions from the weaponsmith to the roof outlook. When he finally made his way back outside, he was shocked at how much cooler it felt, despite the fact that he was still underground and surrounded by a bubbling ocean of magma in every direction. The pub must have been absolutely sweltering with the heat of all the bodies that had been stuffed inside it. Zangetsu felt his beard itching again and pools of sweat starting to form inside his heavy dwarven armor. He would not have been surprised if he appeared to be leaking as he walked. Two dwarves were quietly standing guard on each end of the rooftop, which was really just a forged iron balcony that had been erected between the two tallest towers of the castle, reachable by a single flight of stairs. As Zangetsu began to climb up, he heard the dwarves shout in surprise. One of them even dropped their crescent axe, which he could hear rattle as it hit the floor.
The Tower of Babel. What is it?
Zangetsu cried, racing up the rest of the stairs and skidding to a stop between the two guards. Wordlessly, they pointed ahead toward the far north, where the underworld portion of the Tower of Babel was situated against the glowing yellow and orange, magma-encrusted mountainside. Undoubtedly, the tower was illuminated, pulsing a furious red that brightened and faded like the rhythmic beat of a heart.
The rumors were true. We must inform the king at once.
Zangetsu pressed his hand to his mouth, shaking his head as he muttered against his fingers.
It's finally begun. As I feared. The moon is a precursor to the tower activating once more.
The two watchmen whirled around, just now remembering that they weren't alone, and each shot Zangetsu a funny look.
Hey you! What are you waiting for? Go report, now!
Zangetsu shook his head, suddenly leaping to the parapet positioned in front of the two dwarves and giving a regretful wave as he glanced back at them over his shoulder.
Sorry, but my job here is done. You'll need to report to King Jet yourself. Hey!
One of the dwarves cried.
Wait a sec.
Zangetsu smiled gently and leapt again, flying over the side of the castle and disappearing from sight. The two guards rushed over to the ledge, blinking as they looked at each other.
Wow! What a jump!
I need to get out of sight. Once I get to a safe spot, I can use the teleport stone Master gave me and be on my way back home. I must inform him about the tower immediately. Resting momentarily at the top of a massive tor that the main drag from the mine to the castle had been plowed around, Zangetsu rested his right fist over his left, extending his right index and middle fingers as he closed his eyes and reversed the illusion's spell. In a flash of light, his cumbersome dwarven armor and copious amounts of body hair had melted away, changing him back to his lithe, non-itch-inducing self. Grasping the sides of his yellow cloak, he launched himself back into the air, gliding effortlessly across the landscape, his cloak inflated to turn him into a human kite. As he floated over the entrance to the mine, he spotted a dwarf emerging from its depths, his equipment slung over his back as he whistled cheerfully and painfully out of tune. Zangetsu tilted to the left, trying to avoid having his shadow drift over the lone dwarf so that he could sail by unnoticed. But a sudden current of hot wind rose from the magma, throwing him off course and sending him crashing into a cliff above the mine's entrance.
Oof!
Zangetsu groaned, managing to shield his face with his arms just before he dropped to the cliff's edge. The dwarf continued on his way, his obnoxious whistling blocking out Zangetsu's whimpers. The ninja dragged himself to his feet, pushing his hair back from his face and inhaling deeply.
Ah, my back! That was higher than I thought.
He reached into the hidden pocket of his leggings, fetching the teleport stone and gently rolling it between his fingers. I need to concentrate on the location I want to arrive at. Think of Eblin. Think of home. He closed his eyes, touching his chin to his chest as he trapped the teleport stone between his folded hands. He could feel flecks of ash and ember dance over his skin as another gust of wind rushed over his body, sending his cloak fluttering behind him. It was hot. Unbearably so, he felt as if he were about to spontaneously combust.
Dad! Watch out!
His eyes snapped back open, and he realized he had been holding his breath when he felt an intense burn spread in his lungs. Exhaling sharply, he reached up, brushing his fingers over his dampened cheek. Rye. It's been 17 years. But I still can't think of Eblin without dreaming that you'll be back home, waiting for me. It should have been you on this mission for Master Edge. It should have been you living your lifelong ambition of serving Eblin as a ninja and as a member of the Eblin Four, but now I can only serve as your lesser substitute, so that your sacrifice for me will never be in vain.
Help!
Zangetsu gasped, instinctively reaching for his spear as he turned. Circling the poor dwarf that had been trying to make his way home was a Belphegor, and the elder of the Eblin Four could see its bloodthirsty scowl all the way from where he was stationed above the mine as he watched it extend its claws. The creature had been nothing like what he and the other dwarves had fought on patrol and was something he would have expected instead to see deep within the mountainous regions of Eblin. Something was horribly wrong if one had ended up all the way down here.
AHHH!
The dwarf screamed, falling face first as he scrambled to protect his head, his mining tools scattering from his knapsack as the Belphegor dove in for the kill. Zangetsu clenched his jaw, lowering his hand. Even he would have trouble impaling the Belphegor without hurting the dwarf. He feared he wouldn't be able to pull up in time to retract his weapon. It will have to be magic. Rye. If you can see this, please lend me your strength. Zangetsu closed his eyes, pressing his index fingers together as he whispered a foreign incantation under his breath. In the distance, a peal of thunder erupted, and both the dwarf and monster looked up to the sky in confusion as the underworld plunged into darkness. Eblin, 17 years prior. Zangetsu was pinned under a pile of rubble that had suddenly collapsed upon him, raining down in dust-ridden chunks from what had once been the ceiling of the castle inn. He had been waiting impatiently, both his sunrise drinks already ordered, his son would be home any minute from his first trial mission with the Royal Guard, and there had been no doubt in his mind that they would be celebrating Rai's acceptance, he just had a feeling. But then a cacophony of screams had rung out, and before Zangetsu could flee from his seat to see what had happened, a mass of flame had burst through the window he had been facing, sending shards of glass slicing through the air like shuriken. It was a flame beast, but not one of normal size that you would occasionally catch stalking through the Eblanesa desert. It was enhanced in both strength and girth by something darkly powerful. He could feel its energy consuming every last atom of oxygen in the room, despite the gaping hole it had just torn asunder in the castle walls. That had been when a terrific crash echoed above, and the ceiling collapsed upon him. His knees and legs crushed, Zangetsu could only watch in terror as the flame beast approached, raising its paw to deal the final blow to his head. The heat looming over him was so intense that he could feel the skin on his face bursting into charred blisters.
Dad! Watch out!
Rai! His son had materialized from the hole in the ceiling, landing between him and the monster and thrusting his spear into the beast's shoulder in an attempt to distract it as he turned to quickly start lifting away the rubble.
Get out of here!
Rai cried, shoving off the final slab of rock that had pinned him down. Zangetsu shakily rose to his feet, even though he could feel the swelling throb of torn and sprained muscles straining to support even his slight weight.
Come with me. Dad, I can't. The castle is not lost yet. I have to try to fight back.
The flame beast lunged forward, wrapping its jaws around Rai's left arm as he roughly pushed his father away. There were screams, although Zangetsu could not be sure from whom they were erupting, and he felt a pair of hands lift him away as his legs finally gave in to their subjugation. When he next opened his eyes, he had been lain out on the floor of the cave of Eblan, and Rai was gone, forever. The guards that had rescued Zangetsu presented him with Rai's spear. It was all they had been able to recover from the wreckage when the fire had finally burned out days later. A shower of lightning detonated above the Belphegor, tearing through its scaly flesh and frying it to dust. The dwarf screamed, scrambling out of the way of the corpse's falling ashes as he bolted toward the castle, wisely abandoning his tools. Zangetsu closed his eyes, a small smile of relief curling over his lips. Thank you, my son. Even now, you continue to watch over me. He glanced down at the teleport stone still clutched in his hand. I have no time left to spare. I'm coming, Master. He tried to invoke a vision of Evelyn once more. This time, he recalled his memory from just that morning, when he, Izaoi, Tsukinawa and Gekao had been laughing outside the castle gates, a rare smile on Master Edge's lips that he knew was there even with his cowl on, for it had reached all the way to his eyes. Master Edge had always reminded him of Rai, not so much in demeanor or looks, and not even that they would have been the same age had Rai lived. It was the fires of determination that he knew tempered their very souls and came to life in their gaze. When he looked into Master Edge's eyes, it was like Rai was staring back at him from beyond the grave. In a flash of divine light, Zangetsu disappeared. Gekao's Tale Moonlight's Requiem. Twilight had begun to settle in when Gekao was able to finally approach the impact site of the falling star, or, more appropriately and perhaps less romantically, as he had come to think of it, the meteor. Earlier in the day, he had started out in Damcyan to check on the Crystal of Fire and had crossed Mount Hobbs to then do the same for the Crystal of Wind, both of which appeared to be safe. In both kingdoms, he had picked up on rumors that various envoys had been sent to investigate the meteor, namely, King Edward's secretary and a company of King Yang's high monks. Wanting to avoid running into either group and risk any questions being asked of Evelyn, Gekao had busied himself throughout the day with the welfare of the crystals, figuring both kingdoms' investigations would end at nightfall. As Gekao traveled across Mount Hobbs for what would be the final time to approach the meteor impact site from the Fabulian territory side, hazy, darkened clouds stretched over the sky, robbing him of the moonlight that would have helped him otherwise stumble through the southern mountain path. Gekao reached up, snapping a dead branch off of a tree and igniting it with a flame spell as a makeshift torch. He figured if anyone had been around, they would have seen him by now anyway. There was no point in taking an accidental mid-air plunge over an unseen cliff.
I wonder if Master Edge remembers our time in the mountains together,
Gekao mused out loud. Of course, no one answered him. There was only a low hiss of wind, barely audible over Gekau's calloused feet crunching the rocks on the pathway to dust. The memory in question had been from when he and Edge had been teenagers. Not many people knew, since Edge had always been ridiculously immature for his age, but the two of them had only been born days apart, and as a result, spent most of their childhood training and schooling together. Even now, if one were to speak both to Gekau and Edge, they would conclude by both looks and poise that Gekau was surely much older, but the truth was, Edge had him beat out by a mere 72 hours. As a kid, Gekau had disliked having anything to do with Edge. He never paid attention to their instructor, was constantly pulling pranks that distracted them from actually learning anything, and perhaps most infuriatingly, got away with it all just because he just happened to be born a prince and had an abnormally strong gift for the ninjutsu arts at a young age that fascinated everyone. In turn, Edge thought Gekau was the living definition of mediocrity and a stick in the mud, and was never afraid to advertise such a fact to the rest of their peers. Gekau learned quickly that even if you weren't saying the right things, people would still line up to hear them if the messenger was provocative enough, so Edge was fairly efficient at quickly turning the rest of their class against Gekau and making his life a living hell. But then the night had come of their first milestone of many to determine which of their class would continue on their journey to mastering the Eblanesa arts. Their instructor and master had randomly drawn their names to conduct their trails in pairs, and being born under what was probably the unluckiest star in the history of the universe, Gekau was paired with Edge. They were to journey north with their partners to the Eblan Mountains, an unsettled portion of their continent that was rumored to be filled with fierce beasts and even ghosts, and conduct what their master had called a test of courage. Gekau was shaken out of his reverie as he came upon a vista he had rushed past earlier in an effort to get to Fabul as quickly as possible. Now that he had returned, he could take advantage of the adequate view of the crater the vista offered. Crossing his arms over his chest, Gekau quietly observed that a thick, purple mist had begun to blanket the meadow that the meteor had smashed into. The few slivers of moonlight that managed to pierce the nighttime clouds reflected off the opaque fog, giving the entire valley below an eerie, prismatic sheen. It's a scene straight out of a nightmare. Gekau frowned. A rotting stench had lifted up into the air as well. It smelled like a combination of spoiled meat and festering waste. And this putrid air. It's as if the earth itself is diseased. It's got to be coming from that mist. Or whatever that is. I don't even want to imagine what would have happened had this meteor struck a town. He had begun debating with himself how much closer he should get when he spotted what appeared to be 5 figures. From his vantage point, they were mere black specks, rising and falling within the rolling mist. Moments later, a burst of light erupted from within the crater, like lightning detonating behind a storm cloud. Ah! Gekau blinked, clenching his fists.
There's still someone. Or something. Inside.
He could feel the teleport stone, warm and smooth, against his thigh in his pocket.
What could anyone still be doing in there at this time of night?
He retrieved the stone, holding it before him. Master Edge said this could only be used a few times. Will it have enough power to get me home if I use it now to reach the crater? I can't put my finger on it. But it feels like something critical is waiting for me below, and it might be gone by the time I reach the crater on foot. Closing his eyes, he visualized the undulating mist wrapping around his ankles, drew deep within his lungs the gag-inducing vapors being released by the earth, and felt a pointed glacial sting drag down his spine. Terror. His stomach leapt to his throat, and when he opened his eyes he found himself surrounded by upended earth, walls of dirt and broken plates of rock substrate towering high above the drifting layer of purple mist. He had been submerged into darkness, no light from the outside world could reach him now. His torch had been snuffed out, and he noticed with disgust that a thin layer of sticky slime had already started to creep over the rotten wood. He tossed it aside into a decaying river.
Hold it. You there. Who are you?
I've been spotted. Gekau blinked. Damn. But then came another voice, softer, but yet much more threatening, in reply, and he realized with stilted relief he wasn't the intended recipient of the question.
Even if I told you, you wouldn't understand.
Gekau lowered his stance, snuffling forward slowly on bended knee toward the direction of the voices. Across the river, he saw the 5 figures he had spotted from the mountain, bare-chested men wearing blue cotton training slacks, all with their heads shaved bald in the same style. Monks from Fabul. Gekau frowned. They never returned home? 2 of the monks stepped forward, and Gekau craned his neck to get a better look. They were towering over a young woman, who was barefooted and staring up at them disinterestedly with glassy amber eyes. A turquoise swell of hair hung down her back, a white, translucent gown clinging to her milky skin like a winter morning frost. She was hauntingly beautiful, but similarly to how nature dressed certain plants and creatures in bright hues to indicate they were poisonous.
What?
One of the two monks who had approached her questioned, taking a step closer so that their chests nearly touched. Instead of backing away, she just kept staring, a slow smirk curling on her blood-stained lips.
Are you going to hurt me? Don't even bother. It's futile. You saw my maelstrom, did you not? Imagine what would happen if I turned it upon you. You will not insult us.
The other monk growled, and Gekao clenched his jaw. She is the one who made that light appear? That's not any kind of magic I've ever seen.
We have honed our bodies under the mighty Master Yang himself.
One of the monks grabbed her wrist, which was swallowed in his meaty hand.
Now, come along with us, we have some questions about this crater.
The girl blinked, baring her silver-white teeth. Fools, run away! Gekao mentally screamed. Another flash of light erupted, and the two monks that had antagonized the girl both seized violently, only the whites of their eyes visible as they collapsed to the ground in a smoldering heap of scalded flesh and charred clothing. The remaining 3 monks stepped back in shock, and the girl lowered her wrist, gingerly stroking it with her other hand as she cocked an eyebrow.
I did warn you,
she whispered, and teleported away with a heaving sigh.
Stop!
The remaining monks called, rushing after her deeper into the crater.
You won't get away with this.
Gekao rose from his hiding spot as their shouts faded away, shaking his head. He knew it was no use calling after them, their pride had been wounded, and worse yet, 2 of their brethren were now dead, or close enough to it. And more importantly, that girl. Who is she? Taking care to step over the dying river and regretting just a little that he did not wear shoes, he had always had a preference for traveling and fighting in bare feet, believing them to lend the ultimate level of stealth that even the supplest leather could not provide. Gekao kneeled next to the first of the fallen monks, who was foaming at the mouth and wheezing for breath in a way that Gekao knew the end was forthcoming. He could also see that the monk now had a hole the size of a child's ball torn through his chest, which would have been clue number 2 that things were not going to end on a high note.
Who are you?
The monk gasped, his eyes still stuck in the back of his head. Gekao smiled gently, even though he knew the monk could no longer see him.
I'm just a passing traveler. Stop her. Save my brothers. I'm on it.
Gekao nodded.
Don't try to speak, okay?
The monk laid back, the twitching of his eyelids slowly coming down from the speed of a hummingbird's wings.
Thank you.
And then he was gone. Gekao pressed his hand to his forehead, feeling a choked sob rise in his throat. Had he intervened, would things have gone differently? Forgive me. I hope you'll rest in peace. Rising to his feet, he could see that the other monk was already dead, his eyes closed and half of his face blown away from his skull. Turning away, Gekao looked toward the mudded path the monks had left behind in their haste to chase after the mysterious girl. I'll do my best to save your brothers. But I have a mission to fulfill. I must return to Eblin alive, no matter what. Eblin, 30 years prior.
I'm glad you've all arrived. Tonight, as I've been telling you, is the first of many trials you will need to pass to become a true master of the ninjutsu arts. This evening, you will be taking a test of courage.
There was a quiet rush of whispering among the group of boys, 10 of them total. The only 2 that had no reaction to their master's announcement were Gekao and Edge, who both had their arms crossed in twin poses and were glaring at each other, neither still believing that they had to complete their first trial together. Their master cleared his throat, and all eyeballs were turned back to him.
The trial will be conducted here in the Eblin Mountains. Behind me, there is a cavern. It only has one way in, and that is also the only way out. All you need to do is reach the end of the path, retrieve the token, and come back. There is 1 token per team, so 5 total. Once you return, you can hand your token to me and head back home. Do not engage with the others upon exit.
What? Edge blinked.
That's it. Yes, Your Highness, that's it,
the master said warily, expecting an argument. But instead, Edge just smirked, muttering so that only Gekao could hear.
Think you can handle that?
Gekao could feel a nerve twitch behind his eye.
I'm not the one we should be worried about when it comes to following simple directions. Ho, ho, ho,
Edge giggled.
I see you've at least brought your spine, but no matter, you won't need it tonight. Just let me take the lead, okay? Your wish is my command, Your Highness.
They drew straws to determine what order they would be entering the cave. Edge graciously let Gekao draw their straw, but when it was revealed to be the shortest, blurted an expletive so foul that even the older teenage boys in their group blushed. Gekao prayed that there would be a sudden earthquake so that he could be swallowed into the mountain and enjoy a quick death. It would be far less painful than having to spend the evening with Prince Edge. Their master clapped his hands together.
All right then, line up, in order. First group, you may enter.
At first, the students who had been left behind stayed quiet, straining their ears until they could no longer hear the first pair's footsteps clomping through the cavern. But one of them in the fourth pair realized that the master hadn't said they couldn't talk to each other while they were in line, and whirled around to face Edge and Gekao.
You know, I asked my father about this trial, and he wouldn't breathe a word about it. It's like some huge secret. I did too,
Edge admitted, which made Gekao's eyebrows shoot up.
Neither my mom nor my dad would tell me anything. What about you, Gekao?
The boy asked, and Gekao shook his head. He hadn't bothered asking his grandmother about the trial, she had never taken it. His parents had, but they were both dead. They had been on a reconnaissance mission when he was just a baby, and had gotten caught. Gekao didn't know all the details, nor did he want to know, but rather than give themselves over to the enemy to be used as a ransom, they committed suicide instead. It had been when he was young enough that he couldn't remember them, but it still stung when he thought about it. Seemingly everyone knew what had happened, so they tiptoed around the topic. Even Edge wasn't crass enough to bring it up, but sometimes the most obscure subject would draw it to the forefront of his mind, like tonight. Was that courageous, what they did? I honestly don't know.
Edge, Gekao. You're up.
Gekao blinked, looking up. He hadn't realized that he had spaced out for so long, and that they were now the only ones left. The pair of boys that had gone before them were walking away from the cavern, and one of them briefly stopped to drop what looked like a golden coin in their master's hand before continuing on. He refused to even look at Gekao as he left. No one wanted to be caught breaking the rules. Edge strode ahead, arms behind his head as he whistled. Gekao scrambled to keep up with him, shivering as he crossed into the darkness of the cavern. After a few seconds, Edge glanced back at him.
Are you gonna light us away to sea or what? I thought that was the only good thing about having you as a partner. Can't you cast flame?
Gekao hissed.
I thought you held command of all the elements, unlike us lowly normal folk. I do, but it's not like I can do them all whenever I want yet,
Edge sniffed haughtily.
What's the point of me wasting my energy when it could be better used for something useful? Just cast flame already. Grr.
Gekao shook his head, holding out his palm and whispering the incantation. A spiral of fire bloomed in his hand, and he held it out begrudgingly so that they could see. The path twisted slightly, but never actually deviated into separate directions where they had to decide where to go. After about 10 minutes, they came to a dead end into an open-ceiling cavern, and Edge stopped, crossing his arms over his chest.
What the hell? I thought there would at least be monsters, or something.
He looked around, huffing.
And where is the token? If those bastards didn't leave one for us, I'm going to be pissed. Calm down.
Gekao cried, wanting so badly to take the palm the fire was in and smash it into Edge's pert little nose and floppy silver hair.
Obviously, there is more to it than that. We just haven't figured it out yet.
He glanced up at the open sky above the cavern walls, noticing for the first time that night that it was a double full moon, although both the moon and its twin were hidden away behind a blanket of thick, gray clouds. There was a dull flash behind them, like someone had walked past a mirror with a candle. Gekao and Edge both whirled around, blinking. The only exit to the cavern, the path they had just taken, was being blocked by a sheen of crystallized light.
H-head.
Edge swallowed, and Gekao screamed as a long, slender hand extended from the barrier, causing it to ripple like a stone thrown into a pond. It was followed by another, and then 3 more. A woman's bare torso pushed through the crystal, her face twisted into a sneer as violet venom dripped from the corners of her mouth. Gekao dragged his eyes away from her face and saw that her lower half consisted of a serpent's body, slippery and pink, which was dragging itself into the chamber. The woman threw her head back, a wild nest of brown hair whipping in the air as she sprung forward on her tail, preparing to strike with 6 outstretched arms.
Snake!
Gekao cried, diving out of the way just before she collided with him. Instead, she smashed into the northernmost wall, letting out a disappointed howl as she began to draw herself into a coil to attack again. Edge was staring at Gekao dumbly, his eyes wide as he watched his partner flit to and fro and randomly throw himself on the ground.
Gekao, what the hell are you on? There's nothing there.
After an hour of climbing in the direction that he had watched the monks go in, Gekao finally encountered them once more near one of the impact site's ledges that would have taken them back to the destroyed meadow. Walking determinedly ahead of them was the girl, who finally came to a stop and whirled around, her hands on her hips. Whoa! Gekao gulped, diving behind an overturned boulder that had probably been blown down from Mount Hobbs. The girl narrowed her eyes toward the 3 monks, tapping her foot impatiently.
Why do you insist on following me? What did you expect?
One of the monks cried in response.
We've got to avenge our brothers.
Don't do it. Gekao closed his eyes. You'll never win. This isn't what they wanted.
Avenge?
The girl blinked.
That's right.
The second monk sneered. The girl looked down at her feet, pressing her fingers to her lips in thought.
Incomprehensible. What is?
The third monk demanded, and she glanced up, her eyes wide.
Abandoning your sole chance at survival like this. Isn't that much obvious?
Gekao pressed his lips together, staring down at his filthy feet, his toenails caked with something black and glistening from the impact site's decaying soil. She's right. Don't be so hasty in throwing away your lives. It's not courageous. Not when there are people waiting for you back home. The 3 monks chose instead to surround the girl, trapping her on all sides. She took a step back, wrapping her arms around herself as if the thought of even brushing against them made her recoil.
As monks of Fabul, we have our honor to uphold. And our honor is our pride, the pride of Fabul.
Gekao lowered his head. Honor? Mom? Dad? Is that why? The girl rested her gaze upon each monk, smirking.
Honor? I have never heard of such a thing.
Another flash of light erupted from her form, enveloping the monks. Gekao ducked lower behind the rock, clenching his jaw as he felt the seething heat blow past his ears, the smell of burning hair tainting the air. The girl turned away as the monks' bodies fell to the ground, flipping her hair over her shoulder.
What is it that makes you want to die so fervently?
Eblin, 30 years prior.
Help me.
Gekao choked out as 2 hands wrapped around his throat, while another 4 pinned down his arms and sides. Edge remained flabbergasted, watching what seemed like an invisible force throw Gekao down to the ground and hold him in place. Gekao wasn't really that great of an actor, right?
Cast flame if you can't reach your axe.
Edge cried.
I can see what's going on. Erg.
Gekao gasped, clenching his eyes shut and muttering the spell. A circle of fire wrapped around the snake, but instead of inflicting any visible pain, Gekao watched in horror as the creature licked its lips, absorbing the flames into its flesh, its tail transforming from pink to a bright, warning red.
It absorbs fire.
Gekao wailed.
I don't know any other elements. Damn,
Edge muttered, shrugging and barreling toward Gekao.
Well, here goes nothing.
He did a somersault, launching himself into a high kick that he felt connect with something as he sailed over Gekao's form. Gekao inhaled sharply as he felt the pressure release from his throat, watching as the snake rolled over from Edge's kick. Edge, not sure where he should land, lost his footing midair and crashed into the crystal barrier. Gekao scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking as he retrieved his axe and swung it over the snake's human head before he could think about what he was doing. With a wet splattering noise, he severed the head from the body, watching it fly into the crystal barrier and hit the floor with a thump next to Edge. The remainder of the body twitched and ceased as if doing an erratic dance for a few moments before finally collapsing in on itself, blood spurting from the hole where Gekao's axe had sliced through.
Is it dead?
Edge blinked, jumping to his feet.
Where is it? Right here.
Gekao frowned, tapping the scaly tail portion with his foot.
Ugh. I absolutely hate snakes. I do think it's dead though. Well, I'll have to take your word for it,
Edge shrugged.
That must have been the test though, hey? Let's get our token and get out of here.
He turned, knocking on the crystal barrier and grinning like an idiot.
Okay, we killed the snake. Let us though.
Gekao turned to Edge, scratching his head. The crystal barrier had transformed into a mirror, for he could no longer see through it to the other side of the path, and instead could now only see Edge gazing into it confusedly. He watched as Edge raised his hand again, this time noting that his reflection was copying him.
What now?
Gekao sighed, approaching the barrier-turned mirror. But as he stepped forward, a spill of moonlight poured into the cavern, having broken free from the cloud cover. He could now clearly see that Edge was the only reflection in the mirror, even though Gekao was standing right behind him in the path of the moonbeam, he was nowhere to be seen.
Gekao!
Edge blinked, whirling around.
Where did you go?
No. Gekao winced as he heard the monks' bodies hit the ground, each with a hollow thump. He kept his eyes trained on his knees, knowing if he looked up and saw the condition of those men that he would want to jump in the fray and tear the girl limb from limb. Now, there were suddenly 5 innocent lives to avenge.
This isn't over.
One of the monks whimpered. Another voice, already trailing into oblivion, whispered.
Don't lose hope. We must. For our brothers.
Ugh. Endure, Gekao. Endure. Gekao pressed his fingers to his temples, clenching his eyes shut. There was another promise you made? Long ago? Can you really bring yourself to break it by challenging her? Eblin, 30 years prior.
I'm right here.
Gekao frowned, reaching out to grab Edge's shoulder. Edge pushed past him as if he were a ghost, running a lap around the seemingly empty cavern.
Gekao! This isn't funny. How did you get out? I'm not trying to be funny.
Gekao protested.
Just shut up and listen for once in your damn life.
Edge glanced up at the open ceiling, as if somehow Gekao had managed to suddenly grow springs in his legs and launch himself out. Running his fingers through his hair, he chewed on his lower lip, his eyes rising back to the mirror. His reflection shimmered divinely, although his silver-flecked eyes were as dull as flint.
So? I'm all alone, eh? Figures.
Edge covered his face with his hands, laughing bitterly.
As expected of the heir to the throne, no one wants to share that kind of burden, after all. But then I can't even pass a stupid test on my own. What am I going to do when I have to actually rule?
Gekao looked down, lowering his axe. It scraped on the cavern floor, but elicited no reaction from Edge. Of course. I get it now. It's called the test of courage, because we're being forced to face our fears. The master must have cast an illusion spell on all of us. I'm afraid of snakes, and of my latent powers not being good enough compared to my peers, thus a fire-eating snake. And Prince Edge. He's afraid of.
You're not alone.
Gekao barked. He saw Edge flinch, spreading his fingers slightly to peek out between them. Gekao marched up to him, placing himself between Edge and his reflection in the mirror. But still, when Edge looked up, he didn't register Gekao's presence.
Edge, Your Highness, I know you think being a prince means that you are inherently alone in this world. I guess I get it, people have a lot of expectations of you, and it's easier for you to turn those expectations on their head rather than try to rise up to them and fail. Who's there?
Edge blinked. His reflection blinked back at him blankly. Gekao sighed. What was he doing, saying all of this to someone who treated him like dirt?
But if you think about it, as a prince, you're actually never alone. As long as you hold your people in your heart, you'll always be part of something bigger than yourself. Loyalty and trust, those things all come with time, and they'll come to you as long as you're worthy.
He rested his hand on Edge's shoulder.
And, obviously, you have a long way to go, but you shouldn't take for granted how well loved you are now. Even if I disagree about that, it doesn't change how other people feel about you. Gekao.
Edge tilted his head, glancing down at the boy's hand on his shoulder. Gekao quickly withdrew, flushing. For once, however, Edge didn't take advantage of his discomfort, in fact, he flat out ignored it.
Hey man, where did you go? I was here the entire time. Oh.
Edge looked down, touching his fingers to his chest and frowning.
I guess you're right.
The crystal barrier quivered and disappeared, leaving in its place a single golden gill. Gekao flinched as another wave of light ripped through the crater, watching helplessly as the monks' bodies were thrown from their previous resting place and smashed into the crater wall in a heap of bruised and burned flesh and broken bones. The girl shook her head, a small smile on her lips.
Such a waste.
She faced the moons above, and Gekao noticed that even though no light could seemingly reach them, he could see the reflection of the twin moon within the girl's eyes, the first time that night he had seen any kind of light in her amber orbs.
The interdimensional elevator launch is going to fall behind schedule,
she sighed, and teleported away without a second thought. Gekao rose to his feet only when he was sure she wasn't coming back, frowning to himself. Interdimensional elevator? Gekao scratched the last of the epitaph on the silver breastplate he had stripped off of himself, gritting his teeth as he attempted to drag his pocketknife down in one final straight line to form the L in Fabul. The shaking in his digits, however, was making the attempt quite difficult.
There.
He sighed, flipping the knife shut and tucking it back into his belt. He placed the breastplate over the inelegant, but tidy, grave he had erected from the rocks and dirt around him that hadn't yet succumbed to the meteor's rot. It had ultimately ended up being too shallow. Unfortunately, he thought it would only last for a few days, barring another one of the girl's maelstroms, should she choose to come back to this place, but it was the best with what he could do in the time he had left. Bowing his head, Gekao folded his hands in prayer. Monks of Fabul, I don't know how to apologize to you, but I have my own honor to uphold. The honor of Eblan. I've sworn my undying fealty to our king and our people. It was wrong for me to make a promise to you that my heart would never allow me to keep. He looked up, blindly reaching into his pocket for the teleport stone. I will atone for this later, after I preserve my own honor. End of chapter.